Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. Today we have pastors from the East Coast to the West Coast, from the Midwest to Hawaii, and it's a pleasure to be with each of you. Today we'll be talking about a hot-button topic, reopening the church. If done carefully and methodically, it can be a source of tremendous encouragement to our congregations. Yet, if we reopen our doors nonchalantly, without prayer and a well-thought-out strategy, we can endanger the lives of our congregants while having disastrous consequences for our churches. Today's frame will be reopening the church safely, effectively, and biblically. So let's first focus on reopening the church safely. This includes understanding risks for transmission and concomitant infection control and prevention practices. Whenever we look at disease, especially epidemics and pandemics, we should understand the overall risk factors for our congregations. Let's face it, many of you are overwhelmed by COVID-19, a new norm of online ministry, and now the prospect of reopening the church with so many unknowns. Therefore, I'd like to simplify these overall risks into 4 tiers within a pyramid. At the base of the pyramid is coronavirus activity in the community. The infection rate around your church underlies all other risks. Next is the organizational capacity to ensure a safe environment for brothers and sisters. The extent to which you develop and implement an effective plan can mitigate other risks. The third tier of the triangle is ministry-related risk factors. All church activities are not created equal. Sanctuary worship is much different than an alpha small group over dinner. And finally, at the very top of the pyramid, every individual and family has unique characteristics that increase or decrease their risk. This graph depicts the statewide infection rate in Colorado. It's important to have an idea of the incidence or number of coronavirus infections over a specific time, particularly in your locale or area. See, active outbreaks within your local community present increased risk of disease transmission. And the situation in New York City is much different from that in sunny Honolulu. Always willing to speak at your retreats, Hawaii pastors. Next, organizational capacity and operational strategy underlie all church ministries. There are many wonderful resources to guide you through the process of writing guidelines for your church. This one in particular is from Wheaton's Humanitarian Disaster Institute. Do you have a thoughtful plan to ensure the safety of participating congregants? What infection control and prevention practices will be adopted during church ministries? What strategies will be implemented to support healthy operations within your church? Issues such as staff leave, absenteeism, and cross-training. Thirdly, how will you communicate to the congregation and staff? These and other important questions should be carefully considered. The next tier in the pyramid is ministry-related risk factors. Every church activity is unique in the way congregants participate and interact with one another, and therefore, every ministry offers differing levels of risk for participation. Let's look at some considerations. Is the patient symptomatic with fever, cough, and chills? If so, you definitely don't want them to worship, and you should politely advise them to rest at home. Yet, even if you accurately screen your patients, roughly 30 to 35% of transmission is from asymptomatic individuals, meaning they seem perfectly healthy to you and I. What characteristics of ministry involve higher risks? There's a few we can name. Number one, activities that involve increased frequency and duration of interactions. Number two, ministries that yield more aerosolization of respiratory droplets, like loud singing, thunderous preaching, and strenuous exercise. Activities that involve physical contact with others, shared items, and some examples would be hugging, handshakes, and passing around of communion elements or tithing bags. Programs within confined spaces without adequate ventilation also offer increased risk. It's really safer to be in a large outdoor field than a tight basement with stale air. Small droplet aerosols in poorly ventilated areas can stay airborne for up to 2 to 3 hours. This is a particular dispersion diagram showing typical aerosols released by a cough. And if you're smart, you'll want to stay away from the dispersal area. You see that cloud right here. Finally, at the top of the pyramid, individual risk factors are unique to every person. There are different thresholds of risk for every individual and family. And that tension is particularly palpable within mainstream media today. See, some family members have pre-existing medical conditions like asthma that make them more vulnerable to infection, while other families may have grandparents living among them and need to consider their safety as well. The reality is that every individual and family has a different threshold of risk for going outside to the grocery store, participating in work, exercise, and activities of daily living. What then are some general prevention measures that churches can adopt? We can screen and keep symptomatic patients at home. We can protect vulnerable populations, such as the elderly and those with pre-existing medical conditions. And we can certainly encourage social distancing at all times. The standard is 6 feet of social distancing, but we don't really have a concrete idea if 6 feet is optimal. The data comes from research from MERS and SARS, so potentially 7 feet or 8 feet is better than 6 feet. In addition, we can encourage individuals to wear masks, to wash their hands, and use hand sanitizer. We can give and afford to put hand sanitizers next to the entrances of our churches, our elevators, and stairwells. And we can also limit surface contacts as much as possible. In general, I would encourage contactless worship without the use of physical Bibles, hymnals, communion trays, or tithing bags. And finally, we should clean and disinfect our church facilities early and often. Let's look a bit closer at 2 of the more controversial prevention measures. Number 1, social distancing, and number 2, the use of face masks. The figure on the left is a meta-analysis of studies looking at the use of face masks in preventing infection. On the x-axis is risks, or the odds of being infected. What we see is that the face mask use is associated with less risk for viral infection. Everything to the left of the number 1 here is associated with less risk of infection. And this is particularly true for N95 masks, which not only protect others from being infected, but also the person wearing the masks. Now, the graph on the right side shows the risk of infection with physical distance. The bottom graph is potentially easiest to interpret, with absolute risk on the y-axis here and distance between individuals on the x-axis. It's relatively easy to appreciate the fact that decreasing risk here, is seen with increasing distance away from individuals. You can see this dotted blue line with decreasing risk and increasing distance. And again, the solid blue line, the red line, and the green line, which represent high baseline risk, intermediate risk, and low baseline risk. Now that we've looked at opening the church safely, let's move on to the topic of reopening effectively. This is not meant to be an exhaustive list, as every church and situation is unique and requires its own calculus. However, I will highlight a few major ministry areas, recommendations, and principles. Let's start with Sunday worship, with our sanctuaries and its various components. The welcoming team and greeters will be key to directing traffic and implementing your operational strategy. You'll want them to maintain social distancing while also encouraging it. This presupposes contactless greeting and a paperless bulletin. As I mentioned before, I recommend in general to have a largely contactless service in regards to touching a door handle, a bathroom stall, or a hymnal and tithing bag. And greeters should also screen symptomatic patients and protect vulnerable populations. What about praise? There's really something sacred, inspiring, and beautiful about praise and worship. The Blessing by Carrie Job is particularly timely now. Yet, to be honest, melodious and sustained singing can scatter droplets and aerosols much more readily than speaking. Does that mean that we forsake singing? Perhaps not, but maybe we consider simplifying the worship team by only having one vocalist instead of an entire band or chorus. Perhaps we can think about utilizing the glass partitions surrounding our drum sets. Either way, you'll want to disinfect the equipment often and distance the worship team from the congregation to protect them. Now, as you begin to think about your sanctuary, anticipate reconfiguring the seating arrangement. Limit attendance to a reasonable number to account for social distancing. It's roughly 25 people for 1,000 square feet. There's calculators out there, but roughly 20 to 25 people per 1,000 square feet puts you in that range of 6 feet social distancing. So if you have a sanctuary that's roughly the size of 3,000 square feet, that means you can have roughly 75 to 100 individuals. The reason you can have more than 75 is because some families will worship together, either as married couples or with youth and children. And finally, you'll want to develop a strategy for entry and exit that minimizes contact with others. Now, we work with what we have. We are not going to move pews that are bolted to the ground. And so if you have those types of chairs or pews that are unmovable, you'll simply want to mark off spaces for use. But if you have portable chairs, you can consider reimagining the space in a way that invites congregants into the heart of worship while simultaneously adhering to social distancing practices. Tables, can be utilized for families to enhance their worship experience and develop intimacy. The speaker could even be centered in the middle of your sanctuary to limit the dead space. We've all been in situations where the space was much larger than the congregation and numbers in the crowd, and we realize how dead the space appears. So as you think about reimagining your space, you want to not only consider the concepts of social distancing, but how to help individuals enter into the heart of worship without a sense of fear. If you have a very large stage, some churches are mega churches, then you could potentially provide extra seating in the very front. In addition, clusters of seats could be interspersed among tables and chairs. You could have single seats, clusters of 2 and 3 and 4 for families. Now, there's really no limit to what you can imagine. Each of your sanctuaries are unique. So reimagine your space in a way that best suits your culture, your context, and your particular style of worship. As you do so, you may need to think about different services in terms of days and times to accommodate all congregants. For Asian American churches in particular, there's a deeper level of complexity with overlapping language services and Sunday programs. Consider vulnerable populations in particular and discourage intergenerational mixing if at all possible. Open the windows and doors to allow for more ventilation. There is a dose-response relationship with large open spaces that have plenty of ventilation and small confined spaces. What about logistics? Keeping track of individuals that worship within your sanctuaries is vital, especially in a season with a high likelihood of sporadic outbreaks in different locales and regions. So you'll want to track the individuals. You're likely already taking attendance. And so while keeping records, you can notify these individuals and families of potential exposure when one of those individuals becomes COVID positive. Remember, 30% of transmission is from asymptomatic people. Many of you have already adopted electronic tracking systems. If you have not, consider a program like Breeze that will greatly help streamline the process. Again, we want to simplify as much as possible. What about small groups? In general, small group activities like Sunday school, fellowship activities, and discipleship groups are lower risk than congregational worship. However, there is increasing risk with larger numbers, increased time together, the sharing of food, and intergenerational mixing. Of course, special populations like the elderly, children's ministry, and the nursery require special planning to mitigate risk, and potentially you'll want to hold off on opening these programs for a season. What about your bathrooms? They are among the most highly trafficked areas within a church. Look at this picture of a typical church bathroom. It's quite a bit nicer than our church bathroom. Think for a moment, what inherent risks can you identify based on what has been presented today? If you want, you can put them in the chat box. Take a look. What do you see that poses an inherent risks to individuals that visit your bathrooms? Well, number one, it's a small, confined space without great ventilation. Number two, there's inherent difficulty practicing social distancing. Number three, what is this? wonderful accelerator. It is an aerosolization machine. And if you use it, it essentially generates viral particles and spreads them in the air. So you'll want to turn off any automatic hand dryers if they exist within your bathrooms. Next, there is likely physical contact with the sink, faucet, potentially the soap dispenser, and even the stall handles right here. And something you don't see, but you can appreciate beyond these doors, is the commode. It's not just touching the commode as you use the bathroom, but really every commode function as an aerosolization machine, just like the accelerator. In fact, when you push down the commode to flush the toilet, potentially viral particles are spewed into the air. Now, feces in general have been shown to harbor virus, although transmission risk is very, very low. Finally, let's think about reopening biblically for a few moments. The truth is, there is no black and white when it comes to reopening the church. Instead, I believe we must embrace the theological tension within shades of gray. The ministry of presence and the freedom of sacrifice are both essential to cruciform faith. The freedom of sacrifice reverberates throughout the Gospels. Mark 12:31 echoes the love of neighbor seen in Leviticus 19:18. Choosing to meet together in Christ's name while endangering our elders' health may place us in the same position as the people Jesus condemns in Mark 7:11 for dedicating property to God that our parents need so vitally for their support. And finally, the greatest sacrifice is yet seen at the foot of the cross, modeled for us to embrace. On the other side of the scale lies the ministry of presence. The author of Hebrews exhorts us not to give up gathering together. And Luke points out the centrality of meeting together in his account of the early church. In Acts 2:42, he gives witness to the actions of this church who devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching, to the breaking of bread, and the prayers. In New Testament times, leprosy was among the most feared and devastating of illnesses. Lepers were typically quarantined and ostracized by the public. Jesus did not run from people with leprosy. He reached out his hand to heal. And Jesus could have healed by word alone and avoided contact, but instead he extended love through the power of human touch. With a leper, Jesus risked what others would have feared as both contamination and ritual defilement. And like Jesus, we should not necessarily be afraid of those who are sick of COVID-19. We need to draw near to them when they are most vulnerable. While grappling with this tension, let us not forget about the sovereignty of God. He reigns over pandemics, plagues, and pestilence. Paul describes him as over all and through all and in all. And God is actively involved in sustaining all of creation and has ordained this time and tension for each of us to grapple with. Finally, Rodney Stark argues that the explosive growth of Christianity was secondary to Christians staying in urban areas during the epidemics of 165 and 251, ministering and caring for the sick. Sound familiar? Today we have that same opportunity. The word pandemic comes from the Greek word pandemos, with pan meaning everyone and demos, population. Every individual in the world is affected by COVID-19 to some extent. Therefore, every individual in the world has a unique opportunity to experience the good news of the gospel. Dionysius once wrote, "Most of our brother Christians showed unbounded love and loyalty, never sparing themselves and thinking only of one another. Heedless of danger, they took charge of the sick, attending to their every need and ministering to them in Christ. And with them departed this life serenely happy, for they were infected by others with the disease, drawing on themselves the sickness of their neighbors and cheerfully accepting their pains. Many, in nursing and curing others, transferred their death to themselves and died in their stead." Brothers and sisters, pastors and leaders, may we model the acts of the early church, that our generation would also experience the sure and steadfast anchor of the soul, the hope that enters beyond the veil. Praise God. Now is the time for questions. And I believe James is going to curate the questions.
I want to thank you. Thank you first. It's just amazing how much we just learned from your presentation and your knowledge. There's one question for you. You mentioned about a tracking system when you talk about reopening effectively. Could you give us more detail about that tracking system and the name of the system?
Yeah, absolutely. Happen to. There is not a particular system that I have in mind, but the one I mentioned is called Breeze. Breeze is a system that our church uses really to attract attendance within our church, whether it's within our sanctuaries and worship services or our small groups. So you could easily use a program like Breeze, B-R-E-E-Z-E, to track attendance. What I'm essentially recommending, James, is that every church, when you open, and keep in mind, I didn't spell out the when to open, because we have individuals all over the country today, some in California, Chicago, Hawaii, Northeast, Southeast. And so I'm under the assumption that everyone will not open until your state and local authorities give you that green light. For example, for those churches that are in the Northeast, there is sort of a synchronized opening within New York, New Jersey, all the way up to Massachusetts. And there's essentially a 4-phase approach. New York City is entering phase 1 on June 8th. And in particular, most churches and worship services would sort of be in the Northeast under that phase 4 of the 4-phase approach for the Northeast. And so with that being said, when we have that green light to worship within larger groups, then I'm recommending that you track those that enter into your sanctuary. And in particular, let's say you have a 3,000 square foot sanctuary and you have about 100 seats. I would highly recommend that you label each seat 1 to 100 and use a program like Breeze, or if you need to, just do it by hand, and place individuals within those seats, keeping those records for at least a month in case somebody is positive. You've already read on the news that this happens. And honestly, it likely will happen because of the asymptomatic rate of coronavirus. Next.
Thank you, Dr. Ko. Another question is, some of our churches, they are in a very enclosed environment, no windows, not a very good ventilation environment. How could we improve that? What kind of measure we can take if that is the case for our churches?
Yeah, wonderful question. And we aren't going to change our buildings, right? We inherit what God has provided for us. And that is also the gift of land and a building. And so with that being said, in general, larger spaces with higher ceilings are, decrease your risk of transmission. But if you have, a sanctuary that is smaller, you work with what you have. and you go sort of to the other side, which is limiting the number of participants or congregants within, per se, a worship service or another activity. And so, as I mentioned, there are calculators out there, but roughly speaking, if you have a 1,000 square foot space, no matter how high the ceilings is, it's roughly about 23 to 25 people if it's individuals, considering 6 foot of social distancing. But it's a little bit more if you have couples or a family, etc. So what I would say in addition is if you do have windows, certainly open those windows, but I would not necessarily recommend turning on the HC. I know it's summertime now and it gets hot, but consider, and you'd have to go a little bit deeper into the way your AC works, but there has been a few studies showing some transmission, with the circulation of the air and drawing that air in. And so I'm not saying definitely not, but you may need to do a little bit more research in terms of the way your particular system in your church works. But, opening windows and doors allows more circulation in general to go out. And if you combine that with wearing of masks, you are certainly decreasing your risk for transmission. Next question.
Wow, thank you. This is a very interesting question. You mentioned about the time for inspiration, praise and worship. Instead of 4 people singing on the stage, maybe just use one. But how about the congregation? Even if we have enough social distance between different groups, but when we sing the droplet, it can blow into the air. What is your recommendation?
Absolutely. A wonderful question, because praise and singing brings us into the heart of worship. And that's something I greatly look forward to entering a house of worship. And so, I recently did a sports ministry seminar. Let's face it, we're missing sports because there really are no sports to enjoy right now. And there are a lot of questions about, what to do if we're playing football or basketball, should we wear masks, etc. And it's sort of a similar answer, right? It's not time to be breaking any records if you're running a marathon or a triathlon. But in general, just enjoy the activity. And I would say the same thing if you're singing in a congregation. It may not be time to belt out the tune, in terms of using your diaphragm and your loudest voice, but maybe using your inner voice a little bit more. And that's sort of for the congregational side, right? I would still recommend wearing the masks, and sort of, you can tell, right? If you wear a mask, we've all worn them recently. If you are really speaking loudly, and speaking loudly is really the same as singing loudly, right? You can tell when your mask is shaking a little bit. So you have that inside meter and voice when you should sort of calm down a little bit. But in general, those aerosols and droplets, which are really 2 different things. Droplets tend to fall to the ground more by gravity, and aerosols stay in the air and linger for a little bit longer. And so you should maybe be cognizant of that. And, this is the part of plan and communicating that plan to your congregation. I'm telling you as pastors and leaders that you can communicate that to your congregations as well. Now, on the flip side, we think and we look at our praise teams, right? And so if you have a typical pattern of having 3 or 4 individuals that sing and harmonize, maybe it's time to consider, as I mentioned, simplifying and just having one praise leader. So you're decreasing the risk of transmission, not only to those in the pews, but also to the praise team as well, right? And so certainly, if you wore an N95, you would greatly diminish the propensity for aerosols and droplets to spew into the air. But have you ever tried singing with the N95? It doesn't sound terrific. So you sort of have to consider and balance, sort of the risk as well as the ability to bring somebody to the heart of worship. And so you all are very creative. One idea I gave you, but there's several other ones, is using the glass partitions. I think most Chinese churches have glass partitions around their drum sets, and that's really not for viral particles, but to prevent the sound from reverberating too loudly. But you could do something creative. The last thing I'll mention is to do the distancing between individuals, the guitarist, the bassist, the keyboard player, and then make sure that you are definitely disinfecting those microphones, the keyboards afterwards, et cetera, et cetera. Next question.
Hey, Dr. Kuo, when we're talking about preparing coming back on Sunday, how should we sanitize the sanctuary? In addition to this question, some churches, we have 2 congregations, 3 congregations. How much time in between we should have between the services? And also, should we sanitize again between the services?
Yeah, that's a very important question. And, I'll share what we're doing as New York Chinese Alliance, because it is essentially not too dissimilar from many of the ethnic churches on this call, majority of which are Chinese because it's a CCA seminar. But in general, there is an increasing level of complexity for Asian churches that have different language, ethnicities, and really overlapping services, Chinese, Mandarin, Cantonese, English, and then Sunday schools, in between, etc. And so cleaning and disinfecting is really vital. I can't really stress the importance of that endeavor. So what we are doing, and this is not necessarily right for you, but a scenario is different for every church, is we're going to start out by just having 2 services, 1 Chinese service and 1 English one. And we're also going to increase the time in between those 2 services. We typically have more than 2 services on any given services, but we're just going to start out with 2. And we're going to have the first service at 9:30 in the morning and the second one at 12:30. So we're decreasing or starting the earlier service 30 minutes early and the English service 30 minutes later. So that will essentially give time to clean the contacted surfaces in between. And I'm talking right now about the sanctuary. And, one important thing that I mentioned is that if you push towards contactless services, then there is less to clean. So for instance, if you had that configuration within your sanctuary, what we're going to do is we're going to have a sanctuary, we're going to have our 3rd floor sanctuary as overflow, and potentially our basement as well. And so after that first service, we will clean all the chairs. And, I don't want to get deep into the details, although I can, but there's guidance on, the types of cleaning solutions within the CDC to get rid of viruses. So you want to make sure you are cleaning all those surfaces so the next person that sits down is not, potentially exposed. And by giving the extra time in between those surfaces, that also gets at the issue that I mentioned with that neat colored diagram of aerosol spray, right? The fact that droplets and aerosols go out in the air as you're talking, singing, or whatnot. But eventually they will drop. And so if you give that time, it will happen. So I think that answers the majority of that question. Next.
Dr. Kuo, you did mention about the bathrooms. I think that would be a very interesting question. That do we have to do a lot more sanitization between a period of time, or we just letting our congregants to take precaution when they use the bathrooms?
Yeah, this is such an important question. And it's really not even a question really of churches, right? It's your workplaces, the grocery store, going to Target or Walgreens. Every store is got to face this issue. And the reality is that those areas are used even more, right? Because let's face it, our churches are only used a few days a week. And the majority of the foot traffic is on a Sunday, right? And so, I will again share with you what we are likely doing. This is not necessarily something you need to adopt, but you can consider your own context, culture, and situation. But because we are going to start when New York State and Governor Cuomo gives us the okay, because we're going to start just with 2 basic services, and we're going to limit the time frame of the service too, right, to only an hour and 15 minutes. And we're not going to start those Sunday schools and all that complexity just yet. We're going to wait. Again, that's up to you, the decisions that you make. This is our sort of paradigm here in terms of a phase 1 approach. But because of that, we're going to recommend that individuals don't necessarily use the bathroom unless it's an emergency, right? So if you're only going to a service for an hour to an hour and a half, you may not really need to use that restroom. And so I get it. Sometimes you can't stop yourself. After you heard, Reverend James speak, you want to cry and you want to pee. And that's totally fine. But if you generally recommend individuals that they use the bathroom before coming to the service, then you'll have a very likely decreased number of individuals using it. So then the second step is definitely cleaning and disinfecting. So by asking you the questions about the bathroom, you sort of have insight into what you can do to make it less risk, right? Turn off the automatic air dryer for sure, and use paper towels instead. If you don't have automatic soap, this might be a great time to get it. You know what I'm talking about. You just need to go to the airport or the mall. You put your hand there, and the soap comes out. In addition, maybe you don't have the handles that are automatic. Maybe it would be a good time to consider investing in automatic faucets as well, because then you're limiting touch. And obviously you could do the same thing even for the toilets as well, right? But in the absence of doing such drastic measures, you can also encourage individuals to use a paper towel, when they're touching a surface, and protect themselves. Just throw it away afterwards. So there's a cohort of strategies you can use. And other ones would also be limiting the traffic within the bathroom, right? So it's not a free-for-all where you have like 8 guys in the bathroom. So limit maybe 1 or 2 at a time, right? That's going to go a long way. But then if you do that, the women's bathroom is going to have a tremendously long line. Ladies, you know what I'm talking about. And that's why if you communicate to your congregation ahead of time not to use the bathroom unless emergencies, then everybody, I guarantee, will fall in line. So those are some of the things that you can mitigate. I would not worry too much about the commode and pressing. Really, there really hasn't been proven transmission of feces, just the fact that it lives on there a little bit. Next question.
I think this is our last question. We do have a few more questions, but because of the time limit, as a preacher, as a speaker, should we wear mask or any like PPE, for us to speak in front of the congregation?
Yeah, that's a similar question to the praise and worship, right? So then I'm pretty loud and boisterous, whether it's on Zoom or live. And so, when I speak, you can hear me in the other sanctuary. My voice carries. And so my aerosol and droplet spray also carries, if you know what I mean. And so, yes, you should take precautions. Wearing a mask would certainly be best, but you have to sort of play around, right? If you wear a regular surgical mask instead of an N95, do you still project into your microphone? Can you still be heard by the congregation? You need to, play with your sound team and optimize the acoustics. Certainly if you end up deciding not to do it, maybe you can do something novel and creative. Part of that, potentially using a clear barrier or removing yourself farther and farther away from the congregation. So typically most speakers are already, 12, 15 feet away from the first row. maybe, depending on who the speaker is and how loud they are, you want to even save the first 2 rows again. And so I think everyone and situation is a little bit different, but certainly you want to consider and try to mitigate those risks to the extent possible.